Okay.
All right. Dr. Renee Canady, thank you for agreeing to speak with me this morning. I appreciate it. And could you tell me what is your exact title over there at Michigan, excuse me, Michigan Public Health Institute?
The exact title is CEO, Chief Executive Officer.
Okay. And MPHI, just sort of a one-liner. What do you guys do?
Our tagline is working with you to promote health, but we advance public health well-being through collaboration and innovation. Um, our goal is to support those directly responsible for assuring the health um, of our people. So,
Okay. Well, within that context, you also were the health officer here in Ingham County. I want to get that out there on the record because I think that that's important that you've actually served that role. And you were a deputy health officer as well. So you
mhm.
have a deep history in dealing with the public health side. Um, and so the sort of the first question is looking at COVID and its rise and sort of the pushback on it. As you know, we had a situation where Rudy Giuliani came into the legislature, was, as it turned out, likely infectious and contagious with the coronavirus. And when the health officer, Linda Vail, attempted to try and issue some quarantine and do some contact tracing, she ran into a lot of walls. So that raised the question to me of, well, where is that? Because it is an executive branch authority, yet it is also a broader issue in terms of the public. So where is the balance when you're trying to address public health within the legislature or the judiciary for that matter? If they're not cooperative, is there any power for the under the public health code to really address that? Is my question making any
Well,
sense?
yeah, no. It's a great question, and I'm going to think about it. I think the challenges that we're experiencing in this particular case with the local public health authority and our legislature is really a reflection of a larger matter. So, um, people didn't really understand public health, and they didn't really understand the authority of the local health officer. There's a reason why health department directors also have the title of health officer, and that officer, the use of that term officer really speaks to authority. People didn't really understand that. When public health is going really well, it can sometimes seem invisible. But when the public health rubber meets the road, if I can use that phrase, everybody's like, "Oh my goodness, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And that's where you see public health officers and leaders kind of running to the the fire. So they have broad sweeping authority. I don't never forget when I was appointed by the commissioners, my predecessor, Dr. Dean Cinco, who was absolutely a phenomenal leader to serve under, he said, "You have broad authority. Get in that public health code, understand it as a tool that you can use to assure the health and well-being of this community." And so now people are starting to see that, yes, there is some um, vast authority that local health officials have. The challenge is, I think, two things. One is relationship. I have lived my career leveraging, building, advancing relationships. And I think if the first relationship that we have is in an authoritative perspective, it's a little bit harder. But which relationships do local health officers need to advance, and which ones can they save for another day? So I think that these actions are being executed sometimes in the absence of relationship, which then makes people more comfortable kind of pushing back. And, you know, the challenge is it's what discretion do you have? Do you execute in terms of advancing your authority?
Okay, so that was, I mean, that's a good broad overview, but when it comes to sort of the balance of the branches of government, as you know, this legislature has often argued that it is a power unto itself, and does not have to listen to what the executive branch says. Is that new, or is that something that we're just seeing today, which is a symptom of the broader political argument? I don't want to divorce it from the politics that are going on here.
Yeah, you know, I don't. It's definitely complicated by the politics. It's complicated by the partisanship. It's complicated um, by a lot of contrasting philosophical lenses. You know, separation of powers and authorities is a landmark component of um, how we live our lives in this nation. I'm certainly not a constitutional authority to speak to that at the federal or at the state level, but I think this has clearly um, agitated a need to get clarity, both in terms of how do you balance out the legislative authority, because they do have that, with the governor's authority, with the overarching authority when there is a threat to the health and well-being of people, that then becomes applied through the governmental entity of public health. I mean, public health is governmental. So I think there's going to be a lot of reading, reflecting, and discussion, or at least I hope there will be, to clarify these conflicting views.
So within that same construct, in terms of the actions and the relationships in addressing the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, as you know, it has been a political backlash against this virus really since April. We've just seen pushbacks on the shutdowns and the public health measures that we know traditionally prevent pandemic upper respiratory diseases and other diseases that are spread that way. How, one, I guess, is sort of a more philosophical question, and that is, how do we as a state get our citizens to have a broader understanding of the importance of having that power in those relationships when the idea of understanding the science doesn't even make sense right?
You know, the challenge, the science is definitely the 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 foundation of this, right? The health officers' decision making is based on science. Public health is a science, right? It's the integration of this biomedical, psychosocial component in making those decisions. And anytime we're dealing with something new, as you've heard this virus described as novel, then people question and doubt the science because it's new. We saw the same thing. I started my public health career in the 80s when HIV was just getting on the scene. People doubted the science, they doubted the messengers bringing the science. And so, from that aspect, I don't think it's unusual what's happening with coronavirus. People, you know, and we don't want people just blindly accepting things. We want them to read and learn and become educated themselves. And we, as public health professionals, are vehicles of that information. What I think has happened with coronavirus is it's just gone on longer than anyone would ever have expected. And I think that duration and that constant recurring message, instead of causing people to feel comfortable with the message has been really a contributor to the doubt. None of us have ever experienced anything like this in our lifetime, right? So they're sort of like, well, this can't be right. And if it goes on in this rate, we're going to be on lockdown for another year. And so people started looking for their own solutions. And thank God for the success of the vaccination efforts, because, a house divided cannot stand. And we were heading in that direction.
Well, I guess I have to sort of push back on two key elements there. Didn't you also see similar pushback on HIV as it was arising in the 80s from the LGBTQ community, where they were saying, you had sort of two different camps. One camp that said, hey, stop policing our sex lives. You have no proof that this is a sexually transmitted infection. We're going to keep going. And another camp that said, yes, okay, we buy the science, and sort of pushed in the other direction. Just as we see with coronavirus, the difference is that because this was a morally questioned group, and I use that in quotes,
Mm-hmm.
that it was, it flew under the radar. It was a very different conversation because it wasn't community-wide. It was narrowly focused on one oppressed subgroup.
You're right. And I don't have the numbers and the data, but my general impression is that it took, sort of longer to the dissemination seems to have been a much more extended process in the 80s with HIV than what we're seeing with coronavirus. But candidly, if we had a ticker tape reminder of this, of HIV or of flu, of lots of communicable diseases, if we had the attention on them that we have on coronavirus, maybe the discourse would be different. But the educating folk, the partnerships with your field and your colleagues is critically important. We've got to have those broad sweeping messages that hit lots of aspects of our communities, as opposed to kind of the public health tradition of hiring health educators and getting out there and doing sessions and working with people. The nature of this disease wouldn't even facilitate that. So there have been, I think, lots of challenges to customary public health interventions, and we've endeavored to adapt those consistently to meet the challenges that we were facing.
Well, within that construct then too, I'm looking at a case in Clinton County where we have a bowling alley that has been served with multiple cease and desist orders. Its liquor license has been yanked, and yet it continues to operate. And yet the answer that I'm getting from the public health authorities and law enforcement up there is, well, we're going to let the civil process play out through the state, and we'll see how that goes. In part because there's concern about safety, and as you know, the public health authorities across the state and across the country have faced horrible backlash for enforcing their public health laws. So is there an ethical responsibility for a health officer? And I'm couching this in a broader question. When they say, if I'm a health officer and I say this business is actively spreading a disease, do I have an ethical responsibility as a health officer to act quickly, regardless of what the potential long-term political fallout may be, if I believe that there's that threat?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the question. That's a tough question.
It's a tough question, but tough questions are going to advance our thinking and our dialogue in this space. So here's what I would say, Todd. I would concur that yes, there's an ethical obligation, there's a professional obligation, and dare I say there's an epidemiological obligation. But in my mind, I think about, if you're speeding, you are clearly breaking the law. And if a police officer stops you, then we are faced with what we call professional discretion,
Right.
interpretive, right? Situational interpretation. And you may get a ticket, you may get carted off to jail, you may get a warning, or he may have, or she may see you speeding and they choose to not stop you. This conundrum, I'll call it, of discretion is vitally important. And it's vitally important for leaders to have that interpretive authority. One of the things that I always say that one of the most unfair things we can do is to treat everyone in every situation exactly the same, because every situation is not the same. And so, I'm vaguely familiar with the scenario that you're referencing. I don't have all of the inside interpretive circumstances, and so I tend to be inclined to not speak um, in those circumstances when I'm not sure what's informing their decision making. But I do know that we, as public health officials, have discretion and have the opportunity to interpret how we act and when we act and why we act.
Right. So, and again, that's an example, but I do think that there's a broader contextualized question here about that discretion. If you've gone to the point where you've issued a cease and desist order, but you're not enforcing that cease and desist order, doesn't it eventually become it's a threat without any teeth?
Mm.
Doesn't that ultimately undermine the public health authority?
Again, I think that's situational. I think the use of cease and desist, the execution of or the extending of a cease and desist in and of itself is an important action. The consequences, if and when a cease and desist is breached, um, probably should be thought out at the time that you issue the cease and desist. And I would assume that public health officials do that in consultation, with their sheriff, with other shared authorities in their jurisdiction. So I'm going to make that broad assumption because those decisions are not made in isolation. The interesting thing, local health officers are appointed by elected bodies, commissioners, in the case of city health departments, by the city council, hired by the mayor. So it's not an independent decision. It's made in consultation with those elected officials.
Right. So again, we come back to politics ultimately have a role in the enforcement of the public health code, which was imagined not to have political ramifications.
Well, it kind of depends on how you're defining politics, right?
Small p.
Say again?
Small p politics.
Small p. Okay, yes, small p. Yeah, I mean, these are contentious, controversial decisions that have to be made together, and they play out in the public, and they deal with lots of different stakeholders. And as we've seen with coronavirus, they take a long time to resolve.
Okay, so since we're coming up quickly on the end of our conversation already, which is disappointing because I miss talking to you.
Yeah.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you think is really important to this conversation about the balance of public health and politics and balance of powers? I mean, there's so many different layers to this.
Mm-hmm. I think what resonates in my mind is I'll just use the phrase civil disobedience. And I don't know if I would categorize this as civil disobedience or just out and out law breaking, right? But what is that balance of personal responsibility with social responsibility? And how do we as a community, dare I say society, get back to a concern about each other? You know, unless you're a hermit living in isolation on an island somewhere, your life is impacted by others. I mean, we are in relationship all the time. And so the disappointing thing for me has been sort of the self-centeredness that I've observed in many of the behaviors across this pandemic, just sort of like, well, I'm good, so I don't have to worry about anybody else. So this idea of when is civil disobedience acceptable and why, and how do we continue um, to, with respect, sort of argue the matter out, come and reason together or disagree together. How do we do that in a way that advances the well-being of our community, our society, and doesn't further the chasms that we're beginning to see in this hyper-politicized, shared communicable experience?
Wow, that's quite the lofty goal to leave at the doorstep as we walk out.
I'm throwing down the gauntlet now. They better do it. We got to do it.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. Thank
Okay.
you.